Okay, well, I want to welcome everyone this evening to our learning tonight of Judaism on the big screen. It actually feels kind of timely that this is the conversation of this week, because if I was to pick anything from the Torah that feels that it was made in Hollywood, well, the Joseph story, well, feels very much that it would be a big production. And I know that we've seen it through DreamWorks and other, ways of bringing that to life, or also on the Broadway stage as well. But I bring up the Joseph story because it's interesting that Joseph himself, his identity is quite hidden of his Judaism during his time and his rise to power in Egypt. And of course, well, that leads to the Israelites making their way to live in Egypt. And of course, well, we get to the Passover story. It brings up a big conversation about, well, how do we portray ourselves? Do we hide our Jewish identity, or is it, part of who we are? And I think that brings us to tonight's conversation. And I'm so happy to be welcoming Abe Friedtanzer, who holds a bachelor's in cinema studies and journalism from NYU. And but that's not the only thing. His cinema studies isn't his only background that he's bringing tonight. I know for myself, Abe, my connection to Abe is through USCJ, through the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. My fiance Amanda first started working with Abe when he was coordinating USY on Wheels and helping all of that logistics. And what a wonderful program that is. And Abe and I first got to know each other when I was a college student, and Abe was working for Koach, the conservative college outreach program on all different campuses, and having spent a few conventions with Abe there as well. So Abe brings all of that together, both his Jewish background as a Jewish educator and also his love for, well, his passion for television and movies, which he turned into a career. As now Abe is joining us from Los Angeles. So I guess I'll say good afternoon to you, and to everyone else, I'll say good evening. There in Los Angeles, Abe is a film and movie critic. A film and TV critic, sharing daily updates on his favorite TV and movie recommendations. I'll be honest, when I'm looking for a recommendation, Abe will always remind both me and Amanda that we could just go to his website, either Movies with Abe or TVsWithAbe.com. But it's more fun to get a personal update every once in a while of selected picks. And of course, Abe also has done a lot of work with different publications, and throughout the pandemic, like on Zoom right now, has done a lot of wonderful interviews with both actors as well as the creative teams that have brought so many of the films that I think a lot of us have really enjoyed. I know one of them in particular was Unorthodox, that kind of came out at the beginning of the pandemic. Not that it was planned in that way, but that also led to a lot of us having conversations about Judaism being on the big screen, especially when all of us, were home with our tiny screens. And so I'm going to turn things over to Abe, who is going to maybe start talking a little bit about that experience of Unorthodox. But we're so thrilled to have you here, Abe, joining us tonight with our Temple Sinai community.
Thank you, Rabbi Hollander. I'm very excited to be here. And I'll just note in terms of my Jewish background that I actually know Shira from when I was in USY. So long before you and I met, Shira and I were in New England together with USY stuff, which is nice to be reunited again in this context. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I get to talk about movies and TV all the time. It's one of the most exciting times of the year right now because it's awards season. So there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of great films coming out, and there's still TV on too. But it's nice to get to frame things within a Jewish context because there really is so much out there. And it's especially nice to be able to talk about it with a knowledgeable community about something more than just a surface level portrayal. And so that's what I would love to talk about a little bit tonight. And I'll just start by saying that I went to a screening last night of a movie called The King's Man, which has nothing to do with Judaism at all. But I was watching it, and it's a very, very fictional film that talks about how there was this secret group of evil people trying to keep the world in World War I to make sure that the balance of power was maintained. And obviously it's made up, but I kept thinking throughout the film, I was like, what actually happened? What is the real history behind this? What was the inspiration for this? And I wonder if when people watch fare like Unorthodox or Shtisel or something else, do they think, I wonder if this is what Judaism is like, but what's actually accurate and what's not there? And obviously those with some Jewish background or knowledge of Jewish practice might have some sense, but especially when we're looking at something like ultra-Orthodox practice, what elements are shared within all movements and other things like that. So I think that's a very interesting question. I'm also not sure what the responsibility is of a particular program, whether it's a film or a TV show, to portray Judaism or anything authentically. And so that's another thing I sort of want to delve into. As Rabbi Hollander mentioned, I've done a lot of interviews recently, and my first Zoom interview at the beginning of the pandemic was with Alexa Karolinsky, who is one of the co-writers for Unorthodox. And this was a couple weeks after that show first premiered, long before My Unorthodox Life and anything else, that came after it. And I got to talk to her a little bit about the show and inspiration behind it. And so I'd love to show a brief clip where I asked her one of the questions that we're talking about, and so that you can all hear her response to that. Was there a concern also that this portrayal of one kind of Jewish community would reflect poorly on all Jewish communities, and did that influence how you approach the making of this?
Yeah. I want to say no, but not out of naivete, more out of the fact that I really truly believe that Jewish culture is not monolithic. And I think it's really important to kind of actually just go with that thought, is that yes, this focuses on one element of it, but there's so much other stuff that focuses on other elements of it, and it's not one movie or one TV show's job to show everything. I mean, think of all the TV shows you like, and I mean, my God, I mean, think about all the other cultures and religions in the world and how some of those are portrayed in some television shows. I don't even believe that Hasidic Judaism is painted in such a bad light in the show, actually, what we went with, and that was really the driving force, is our main character, Esti. And her story, was the priority. And I do feel like we would have gotten lost and in trouble with it, I think, if we had said, okay, well, this is a show about that community. And then that's wrong, because then, who are we to talk about that? But this is about, Esti and what she goes through. And frankly, it's about Yanki and Moishe, who are both in a way, I think have their own personalities and histories and effects of growing up in such an insular world, I think people who are scared of anti-Semitism because of a show like this will be scared of anti-Semitism with everything, I also think, growing up in Germany, and I'm so sorry, delving very deeply into the Holocaust and what led to the Holocaust, and trying to really understand it on many levels, in order to actually be German. I think it would be really wrong to say that Jews create anti-Semitism, through the stories they tell, I think that's actually quite a problematic notion, but, there were a lot of assimilated Jews in Germany who blamed anti-Semitism on the more East Jews, on Orthodox looking Jews. And they said, if they weren't here, then the Germans wouldn't hate us. But obviously, that's I don't know. That's a whole different conversation. It's an interesting conversation, but no, I don't believe that. I actually believe showing Jewish culture as having all kinds of different people, it really helps. And I have to say that the amount of messages and love we're getting from everywhere in the world, we're number 7 in Saudi Arabia right now, which I can't explain.
Awesome. Yeah.
I don't understand why, but we're getting all kinds of messages from everywhere in the world. And so much from the Muslim world saying this culture is so similar to our culture. Like, and I think that's very important, and it means that people are connecting with the emotions of the characters, you know?
So I hope everyone was able to see that clip okay. Since we have not too big a group, I would love to hear maybe from a few people about reactions to that reaction, whether you agree with that, if you've seen Unorthodox, even if you haven't, just in terms of whether there is some sort of responsibility of a creative person or team to portray something authentically, and whether that's something that could lead, as she says, it can't to, or shouldn't, to anti-Semitism. Rabbi Hollander, do you want to select anyone if anyone wants to raise hand or put in the chat something?
Ken.
Yes. As I was listening to her, I had one set of opinions, but it was the last couple of sentences that she said about Saudi Arabia, which reminded me that when Fiddler on the Roof played in Japan back in the 60s, the Broadway show, one of the reviewers wrote, "How can this be Jewish? It's so Japanese." And it's in, I think when anything becomes very particular in itself, it exposes a universality of people.
I like that a lot. I think that's a very good point and a sort of unexpected positive. As you could see by my reaction during the video, I was surprised to hear that about Saudi Arabia, and I think that's a very exciting and unexpected thing. Anybody else have thoughts? We can continue to share as we go on. So what is interesting to me is that I do think there is a strong portrayal of community. I think especially with Unorthodox, it's really interesting how detailed things are and how much there is there that doesn't need to be there. I also think there are certain elements that if you weren't Jewish, if you weren't ritually knowledgeable, even if you were, that you might not pick up on. There's a song that Esty sings, which is a traditional Jewish wedding song. And while that is featured earlier in the show, being sung by someone else at her own wedding, it's not something I think that would be an automatic connection for people. And I know it's a song that was sung at my wedding. And so for me to hear that, it was a very emotional response that I don't know was so universal. And I think that's very intriguing as a concept, that what is the purpose of such specificity? Because I feel like very often, especially with something like, for instance, the Hallmark Hanukkah movies that have become a little bit more prominent recently, everything is very surface level and there's not a lot of detail. And the idea is, well, let's talk about a menorah, let's talk about not having a Christmas tree, let's talk about these things of Judaism which don't really get us very deep. And it's possible that that is the kind of Judaism that people who aren't familiar with it, or who are familiar enough, feel like that's what they need to see and that's enough for them. But I'm curious whether that's something that I personally know I get excited when I see something that feels authentic. And then when it's not quite correct, I experience a little bit of disappointment. That, for instance, if there's a Torah reading and it's going great and then they do a blessing that's not supposed to be there, or they're wearing tefillin on Shabbat, or something that really isn't so important, that I sort of latch onto that and say, well, that's so close. And obviously there was someone there, who was advising, who knew enough, but didn't, quite go far enough. And so I just find that to be very, very, very intriguing and not always consistent. Because as Alexa was saying, in terms of the people who are Muslim who are very excited about this, I think there is something very cool about learning about another culture through media like this. But there's also the risk that what people are learning is not the most flattering, and not the most accurate. I think for a lot of people related specifically to unorthodox, there are people who had very negative experiences within ultra-Orthodox communities or within any kind of observant Jewish or non-Jewish community, and felt like they needed to escape from that. But even in the short summary I would always tell people or hear about when I was talking about unorthodox, it was an escape from this community. And that in itself doesn't quite feel right, because I know there are a lot of rituals and elements, the observance of Shabbat. People, I don't have payas, but that kind of thing, the things that are important specifically because of things in the Torah that I don't think should only be seen as negative. And I think there definitely is a risk of that. I don't know that it necessarily fosters anti-Semitism, but I also, when I was working for Koach, as Rabbi Hollander said before, I used to do a study session where I would look at certain portrayals of Jews that weren't necessarily accurate, and they're meant not to be accurate. But if you have somebody who doesn't know, what is your responsibility to educate them? The best example is Borat, which is from somebody who is Jewish, who is very knowledgeable. And one of the big jokes in the film is that when he is playing this character Borat, he's actually speaking Hebrew the entire time, but you wouldn't know that unless you knew Hebrew. But also that there's the thing called throw the Jew down the well. They're mocking Jews, saying they're money grubbing, all this. And it's meant to be a send up of how ridiculous people are and the capacity for hate. But it's very possible someone would watch that and they've never seen Jews, they don't know anything about Jews, and could take something away. That might be a bit too extreme, that we should all know that there's some level of parody, and anybody who watches Borat and doesn't understand that it's a parody, it's going to be lost on anyway. You have something like Inglourious Basterds, which is not from a Jewish director, though it's one who is married to an Israeli, and that's Quentin Tarantino. Inglourious Basterds, I happen to think, is a very, very good film. It's very violent, but it depicts an alternate history in which there was a band of Jews who went through Nazi Germany, killing Nazis in very brutal fashion as, revenge for what was happening to their fellow Jews. And I could imagine somebody who has no idea about the Holocaust, because we've all heard about how Holocaust education is really not what it should be in a lot of the country in the world. And someone say, I didn't know that there were Jewish squads who went around exterminating Nazis during the Holocaust. And that to me seems like a very problematic notion, that someone could take that and read it at face value. That said, again, if you know more, Quentin Tarantino is very big on embellishing history. His recent film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, is very much revises things. But that's another that people don't have to read up on a film and actually know about it before or after they see it. I know that when I watch something like The Crown, every time I watch an episode, I go online afterwards to read about what actually happened, but I'm going to Wikipedia. And Wikipedia is a source I could edit myself. So there's no reason to say that that's necessarily accurate either. And another example from that is just there was a movie called Casino Jack about Jack Abramoff, who is a lobbyist who went to jail. And at the very beginning of the movie, he's seen in jail and he's saying, do you have kosher food here? I need kosher food, because he's an observant Jew. And so from the very moment you associate that this person who is a criminal, who is very manipulative, he is first and foremost flagging his Judaism. And that's something that, again, in that case is actually accurate. But again, I don't know that that's something so helpful.
Abe, I wanted to actually ask you a question about this, of like, how have things changed? So you mentioned about, Ken brought up Fiddler on the Roof. And before we met, I already told Abe that I was doing a little bit of searching of, Abe has written a lot of things. And of course, as we're in award season right now, I forgot to mention that Abe has watched every single Oscar nomination I'm trying to remember my notes here. Every Oscar-nominated movie and fall TV pilot each year. So I know that you're up to date on all those things. But I was looking actually back on a blog that you wrote back in 2013 that was talking about Fiddler on the Roof being the exception of the exception. That Fiddler on the Roof, yes, this Universal piece in 1971 went off and did really well in terms of nominations. And for the award ceremonies. But it was interesting in this blog that you were talking about Jewish films in for the Oscars, you kind of broke it down into three different categories. You had anti-Semitism films, you had Holocaust films, and you had Israel films. But it's interesting. I think that Unorthodox probably broke that that mold. Do you feel that maybe we're more sophisticated now that we can actually have conversations about Judaism versus needing to only talk about anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, or Israel?
Yes, I do think so. I think that's just in terms of categorizing Oscar conversation movies. I think there are other ones out there. Again, I'm not sure there is such a wealth of depth that I would like to see that I was discussing before. Another thing I spoke about with Alexa is the fact that Unorthodox is largely in Yiddish, which I think is a pretty big thing. But I do think, as I've mentioned before, that people could watch Fiddler on the Roof and think that's what Judaism is, even though that film is set in the past. That is not the present. That is not how a lot of people live. But I do think that there are more. I think there are more films these days. I think in terms of Israeli cinema, we're certainly getting a lot of it. That with things like HiFlix and even Netflix, that there are these, not just Fauda, that we have Hit and Run, we have other series that are coming. But I don't know that those tend to have the same kind of Jewish content. This year's Israeli submission for the Oscars for Best International Feature is called Let It Be Morning, and it actually has an all-Palestinian cast and has almost nothing to do with Judaism, and its only depiction of Judaism is Israelis and Israeli soldiers. And so that doesn't have anything to do with observance. It's culture, and it's a great example of multiculturalism within Israel that I think we don't see as much. But again, even Israel is a country that has received 10 nominations over the course of about 50 years for that Best International Feature category. And as of the last time I checked, it's one of the most nominated countries never to win. It probably came closest with Waltz with Bashir, which was in 2008, which is an extremely compelling documentary animated look at the Lebanon War. But that also has nothing to do with observance. That's where people happen to be Jewish because they're living in Israel. And you can say that the identities are so closely related to each other. And I do think that's true. I think that there are films, Israeli films, where people are wearing kippot, some people aren't wearing kippot, and it's just sort of part of the culture. And I don't know if anybody watched the show Our Boys, which was on HBO, which is an incredible Israeli drama that is actually quite critical in a lot of ways of how the Jewish Arab relations in Israel. But there's one scene, an episode that ends very dramatically, and it's one of the characters turns around and he's singing El Chad Odi at Shabbat services. And that's a very cool moment in a way that I don't know what people who haven't been to service, who haven't seen that, who aren't familiar with that melody, that what do people think when they see that? And so I'm excited when I see that. There's also a film called 1 Week in a Day, which is about the day after Shiva and the inability to move on. And that's something that's just sort of inherently present in Israeli cinema. And so I think in terms of Jewish content, Israeli cinema is inconsistent because sometimes it has things that are completely secular or completely religious. And one other thing that I think is very interesting is that there are so many films, when you're not talking about anti-Semitism or the Holocaust, but you're talking about just portrayals of Judaism, usually you'll find films about people trying to leave, people who don't want to be part of whatever they grew up in. You can see this as early on as Woody Allen. A lot of his films, there's a famous scene where he meets Annie Hall's family in that film. And I believe it's her grandmother who looks at him and he's suddenly, wearing Hasidic garb because he thinks that's how she sees him just because he's Jewish. And another film later on, Crimes and Misdemeanors, where he has a very emotional moment. Not him, but Martin Landau is dealing with his guilt over something, and he hallucinates and imagines a previous Passover Seder, where basically they're taking the wisdom of the Haggadah and of Judaism to be able to confront this. And that's something that when you think about Woody Allen, he has a lot of Jewish and Nebushi content to what he does. But I think when you get a little bit deeper, it's really, really nice to see that. But as I mentioned, it's just so rare to see something that's not rejection. there was a show called Nip Tuck years ago, which didn't have a lot to do with Judaism. But there's one episode where a teenager is trying to really grapple with his faith because of something he's done. And so he very dramatically eats a cheeseburger in the school cafeteria. And I think he's still wearing his kippah. And so that's his way of marking rebellion. There's another film called Song of Names where someone wants to disassociate and they do something where they either rip or step on their kippah and say, I renounce my Judaism. And I saw that and I said, I have to do some research. Is this something that people actually do? What is this? That happens to be a very good film, but a strange example, I think, of that. Another very, very good example, going back to something like unorthodox that is so thoroughly researched. There's a film called Disobedience, and I actually happen to have a shirt from this film, which I thought this is the perfect occasion to wear it. But Disobedience stars Rachel Weisz as a woman who left her Orthodox community in London and goes back home when her father, a very revered rabbi, dies. And she left because she had a lesbian relationship with one of the people she knew. And so when she returns, she's in her own secular life, but she gets sort of sucked back into this. And I got to speak to the director a couple of years ago. I interviewed him for a publication called Juicy, which was part of Tablet Magazine. And he is somebody, he's not Jewish. And he said he wanted to get everything right. He wanted to research things so thoroughly to make sure that what they were depicting in terms of the Jewish community and observance was so accurate. And then they would almost forget about that. That would be the framework. And they would go from there and then structure this love story, where, of course, in the back of the shirt says, love is an act of defiance. The idea that if you want to be happy and really channel your love, you have to somehow reject your Judaism, which, of course, I don't think it means a full rejection of the religion entirely, but for a lot of people, their experiences are very connected to that. I also know that when I was working with USY and Co-op, we did a lot of stuff with the organization Keshet, which works with LGBTQ plus Jews. And someone was talking about how he had to read the Yom Kippur portion, which talks about, an abomination for a man to lie with a man. He was assigned to read that every year, and he knew he was gay, and that was a very traumatic thing for him. And so he fortunately came back to a way to be involved in his Judaism, where he was engaging positively with something that was traumatic for him for a while. But I think it's definitely possible and accurate that a lot of these experiences can be damaging, and reflecting that on screen isn't necessarily just toxic. I think there's some value to it. Because as Alexa said before, there's so many universal experiences where people are dealing with, Christianity or with expectations of what they're supposed to be when they grow up. And a lot of things are imposed by culture. And I know for me, Judaism has always been a very positive experience. I liked Hebrew school. I liked USY. I liked working with a Jewish organization. I have a lot of my friends are Jewish just because those are the circles that I'm in, and I have such positive connections. But for some people I know, that's not what they want, and that's not where they associate. And so I think it only makes sense that would be reflected on screen. I would also note that there are, fortunately, some positive instances where you can have someone who is struggling with something, and it's not just their religion, but it's still portrayed within a deep context of observance. There's a filmmaker, Rama Burstein, who is Israeli. She's Orthodox, and she made a movie a few years ago called Fill the Void, which is a really incredible film about an ultra-Orthodox woman living in Tel Aviv, whose sister gets married and pregnant and dies during childbirth. And basically the family then says that this woman should marry her brother-in-law to basically, continue the family. And it's such an interesting concept because she really grapples with that, because she doesn't know if she loves him. That's one thing. But also she doesn't know that that's what she doesn't want to do that just because that's what she's told. But the entire struggle she goes through, there's never a point where she says, I'm not going to be Jewish. I'm going to go away from my religion. But she has this conflict that is entirely existent within that, which I think is just so fascinating. And there's one scene that actually is in the trailer where the brother-in-law comes over to her and she says, you're too close, because they're showing Nagia and they're not supposed to be near each other. And he said, I could have been closer. And so it's just this real emotional resonance and such a fantastic sincerity to it that I don't know if it would be possible in a film where the people behind the production aren't as aware of culture and customs. And unfortunately, this filmmaker, Rama Burstein, made a second film, which is a real pivot. That was a very serious but amazing drama. This one is a comedy called The Wedding Plan, about a woman who's getting married. And as they're, about a month from the wedding, the groom says, I don't want this. I don't love you. I don't want to marry you. And rather than cancel the wedding, she says, okay, I'll keep the date and I'll find a groom. And so she has 30 days to find someone who's going to marry her. And it's such a refreshing and original concept. It sounds like a lot of American romantic comedies, the same sort of like, what's the gimmick? What's going to happen? But for her, she's going through, there's one person she goes on a date with who doesn't look at her. And she said, you haven't looked at me once. And he says, I don't look at any woman. That way, the woman I marry will be the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. And she, of course, thinks this is ridiculous. But she reached this range of people who basically have different ideas of that's one spectrum of I'm not going to look at a woman so I can pretend this is the most beautiful woman or I can actually believe that. And then there's a secular singer that she's interested in, but he's also still Jewish. And so there's not any like, should I really rebel and do something differently? And so I think it's rare to see those. I think only sort of within the confines of Israeli cinema. But one more example that really I think some of you may have seen is called Menashe, which is a film that was put out by a studio called A24. It was at the Sundance Film Festival a few years ago. And it stars an actor, Menashe Lustig, who basically plays a widower whose wife has just died, and he's raising his son in Brooklyn. And basically there's just all these scenes where he's talking to his rabbi, to his community, and people are saying it's not right for a religious man to be a single father. And he's trying to figure out what he wants because he's really mourning and he's really grieving. And it's just very interesting to see that. And so I hope that in the future there are many, many more examples where we can see this and where we can really get an understanding of what observance looks like in a way that feels authentic and not just sort of, here are a few Jewish things thrown in. I've been talking a lot. I want to pause for a moment in case anyone has any thoughts they want to offer, any questions. Okay. So I will
I had a question, if you don't mind.
Oh, please, sure, absolutely.
So one thing you've talked about a lot is accurate portrayal, and you gave the example of Borat and what, maybe like Americans watching the film or anyone thinks about, would think about Jews. Have you explored or spoken to anyone about the impact that perhaps watching something like Shtisel, and I'm talking about Israelis watching it, how that has been an impact on perhaps secular Jews who living in Israel who might not even know anything about how very religious people live?
Interesting. I have not. I think that's a very interesting question. My assumption would be that there's so much shorthand just based on the way Israel works as a country in terms of Shabbat and holidays and other things that I think people probably know a lot. But I do agree that people probably would find it more, that secular Israeli Jews might find it more foreign than we might as people who identify, mostly I assume as conservative Jews who can relate more to certain rituals, not to all. But I do think that's interesting. And I think that a lot of secular Jews in America as well might watch something like that and say, whoa, this is like what someone who says that they're Reform and they never go to to temple or whatever, they might say, oh, this is what like my conservative friends are like. They do this kind of stuff. And I personally remember I went to my first wedding in college, and it was a friend who I considered to be very frum, and she was led down the aisle in a veil where she couldn't see, like it was completely opaque, and they did the Sheva Brachot, and I was like, whoa, this is so interesting. So like all this stuff. And then at my wedding, I had the veil was not opaque, but all the same, the Sheva Brachot, these kinds of things that I learned about more afterwards. And then I also spoke to this friend later and she said, oh yeah, my mother-in-law wanted me to wear that veil. Like that wasn't important to me. So I was assigning a level of, religiousness to her that was just what she was doing in terms of her own upbringing and what she wanted in order to make people comfortable. So I do think that's a very interesting topic, and I would love to discuss. I don't know how many secular Israelis I know, although there are a few, I'm sure. But I do think that's an interesting topic.
I'll just add in quickly. While I was in my year of Israel for rabbinical school, it was when the second season of Shtisel came out. And so at Beit Avichai, which is basically like the Israeli invention of a JCC, talking about Jewish culture for all Israelis, they had a night. Where they previewed the first episode of the second season. So myself and a classmate went to this premiere. We were sitting in a room, an auditorium of 500 Israelis. We were probably the only 2 Americans in the room. It was all in Hebrew. And it was fascinating. That was really what came up, is that there were secular Israelis and religious Israelis all talking about it. And that was what the directors actually talked about, is that they loved hearing that people are in conversation. It's not just the person who's on the train that you see and trying to figure out what their story is, but maybe actually what film does is gives an inside view. And then they even mentioned about how those in the community of the ultra-Orthodox actually are watching the Shtisel because they have access, because they're using smartphones for work. And so they're watching it as well. And the reason they know this is because there was a wedding song that was sung. It was a nigun that only was from Shtisel. It was written for it. And guess what? At a wedding a week later after that episode premiered, it was at a wedding, an ultra-Orthodox wedding in Israel. And so it became the Shtisel Nigun, and that's how they know that it is a conversation happening with all different people. So I think there's something interesting there as well. Jose Cassell, did you want to share something? Oh, okay.
I'm unmuting. Sorry, I'm unmuting. Okay, so I wanted to ask. First of all, I would say that in watching Shtisel, in fact, I've watched it actually twice, the first 2 seasons, because my wife had not watched it, so I watched the first 2 with her leading up to the 3rd season. And when we go to Israel, we actually are immersed or live in an ultra-Orthodox community, because our daughter and son-in-law are ultra-Orthodox. They are, they have became that way. They didn't grow up that way, but they became that way. And so when we watched Shtisel, we felt that it was pretty authentic in terms of the representation of what kind of goes on in an ultra-Orthodox community. But what I really wanted to ask was, the only movie that we were able to review before this meeting, after I saw the notice, we did watch Get last night, and I wondered if you would comment, on that particular movie.
What we thought.
Well, we really felt it was a pretty bad treatment of the woman, because it just seemed everything was, it was all one-sided, but how realistic is it? I don't know. Because we've heard of cases where men have been forced to give the wife a get, especially when there's been particular violence or abuse, and either physical or mental abuse, that they've been forced to give a get to the wife. So I just wondered what you thought about that particular movie.
Of course, yeah, and thank you. I think I think it's an incredible film. I really in terms of a full-on deep portrayal of just everything Jewish and ritual and everybody wearing kippot and just being part of this whole universe, I think it's extraordinary. I do think it's not a terribly good depiction of what Judaism can be in certain ways, because it's showing a system that's meant to protect people specifically from circumstances like this that is repeatedly failing. If you watch the trailer for this film, basically it shows you that this woman who is trying to become unchained from her husband, who needs to give her this get, grant her this Jewish divorce, repeatedly refuses to do so. And the religious court in Israel is constantly siding with him, that because he won't do it, the woman is seen as being equally uncooperative to him. She's trying to achieve something and he refuses to engage. And somehow they're treated as equal partners in this, where his refusal to do anything is treated as the same as her desire to want to do something. And so I think it is a marvelously compelling and very painful film. I think that to the earlier conversation, if somebody watches it, they might not have a very good opinion of observant Judaism, but I do think that it is very, very much worth seeing. Ronit Elkabetz was an incredible actress who sadly passed away a few years ago, who was in the film The Band's Visit, and she's extraordinary here. And I mentioned actually when I was speaking to Rabbi Hollander and Shira that it's one of 3 films that deal with this subject. There's another called To Take a Wife, and a third, which I don't remember the name offhand, but basically that deal with this idea of religious marriage and what the civil versus religious components of it. And they're very, very worthwhile. So thank you for bringing that film up. I think that one is really very good. And it actually, it did not get nominated for an Oscar, but it did get nominated for a Golden Globe, which I thought was a very cool I feel like, for me at least, especially when I hear about these movies, something gets nominated for an award and I see it. That's enough to tell me that I want to see it. Doesn't tell me I'm going to like it, but it's enough to seek it out and look at it. I think there are plenty of people who are not Jewish and have no familiarity with Israeli cinema at all who seek out these films when they come up like this. And so I think I'm not sure whether Israel's submission this year will make the cut for the finalist list next week. But if it does, I think a lot more people will look at it, which is good. So yes, thank you again for that. And I want to just shift briefly away from this a kind of Judaism that we sort of recognize but don't necessarily know, to something that might be a little bit more familiar. And that returns us to the surface level in some ways, when we're looking at people who are very much culturally Jewish, but may operate in secular circles. And I think the best possible example of this is The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, which is a show that is so steeped in Judaism. There are so many lines that are fired off that I can't imagine somebody who doesn't know anything about Judaism, they're just lost and just move on. Part of it is that they talk so quickly, and Rachel Brosnahan, who is not Jewish, just fires off lines as quickly as possible. But I think it's really interesting when they talk about, they had shellfish at the wedding, or they got the rabbi, or all these different things. And while I might enjoy seeing something a bit more substantial than what we see on there, I think it's actually pretty true to life. I think there are a lot of people who know a lot about Jewish culture, but things don't necessarily get quite as deep for them. The other show that after I spoke to Rabbi Hollander and Shira about doing this has since premiered, and Shira and I were just talking about this before this session, is The Shrink Next Door. I don't know if anybody's seen this show on Apple TV Plus. The season, or I think it's only a limited series, so the series finale is tomorrow. It stars Paul Rudd and Will Ferrell. And Will Ferrell is this, Jewish man in the 1980s it starts. And he has his own business, and he basically meets this therapist played by Paul Rudd, who slowly takes over his life and sort of convinces him that he should do what he's telling him. And it's really remarkable to watch. There is so much Judaism in there. It's not just the accents. It's the way that they just talk about things. They talk about a bris. They talk about all things. There's a scene where Paul Rudd is reading Torah, and quite flawlessly. It's very impressive. And, chanting the blessings and everything. And it's so rare to see. And in a way I wonder how necessary it is. It's fun to look at and see it. But also the character that Paul Rudd plays brilliantly is a terrible person. And so it's not a very good association, to see him in this role. Again, he's terrific, and it's an extraordinarily compelling story, but it's miserable. It also happens that of the 4 main cast members who are all meant to be Jewish, Paul Rudd is the only one who's actually Jewish in real life, but that's a topic for another time, because everyone else really does a pretty phenomenal job. And Catherine Hahn, who plays his sister, Will Ferrell's sister, previously played a rabbi on Transparent, which is another show that I think has a lot of surface level Judaism that's deeply embedded, especially related to feelings towards the Holocaust. So it's very interesting to see that. And I think that's a show that I would highly recommend to anyone to watch. And I would be curious to know your thoughts on it, just because I think it really does a very good job of portraying real people who probably, I don't know if we want their story broadcast this way. And there's one other recent example I can think of that, as I was sort of thinking about topics for this that came up. There's a show called Pen 15, which is on Hulu, which is a comedy series. And it's set in the early 2000s. And there's an episode where there's a bat mitzvah. And it quickly moves on to a party and gifts and all that. But the end of the episode features the bat mitzvah girl just saying the blessings after the Haftorah. And it's pretty much accurate. She's just going and doing it very performative. But it's just, I'm curious, who was it that was so interested that we said we have to have those Haftorah blessings in there at the end of the episode, because that's going to make all these Jewish people excited. I don't know what the impetus behind that was, but I just think it's so interesting. I get excited, I think, whenever I see some inkling of Judaism somewhere, even if it's not necessarily the most accurate, because I think either it's very, very accurate and then it might be hard to sort of recognize. I'm not sure I could see an example of someone who looked like me and had the same Jewish knowledge and experience and enthusiasm that I do, and I could see that and recognize that on screen. I think that there is a tendency to put someone in a big bushy kippah if they're supposed to be, an observant Jew. And so I don't know if that's something that I could necessarily see, but I'm certainly looking for it. And I am excited by the two films I can remember where they mentioned USY and JTS. And so those were pretty exciting moments, even if they were very minor plot points. And I was quite surprised to hear about that. So, and I kind of pause again for any questions. And then I was told perhaps I should recommend a few things we might want to think about watching over the next few weeks as people are at home celebrating holidays, etc.
Abe, I really think, just quickly, what you said is fascinating about the motivation behind adding in such rituals. And I keep thinking about The Shrink Next Door and the emphasis on certain morning rituals. I mean, just really accurately done, but really they don't add anything to the plot at all. I mean, if you take them out and put it in, it makes no difference. So do you have any sense of why you think, and again, we can name example after example after example of why they're added, but don't necessarily add anything to the plot. So why do you think that these things are put in there, given our very tiny population of viewers?
I'm really not sure, honestly. I mean, I think it is, I can imagine that people want to impart their own experiences, and this is what they remember of Judaism or what they know of Judaism. And so in any sort of striving for authenticity, I think that can be important. I know also there are a lot of times where people play real people, Jewish or not, and they don't want to meet the person. They want to, look at news footage, or they want to have their own interpretation, and it's important to them for that. And so I think it's really a creative thing. There is one example I can think of that was very interesting, a movie called To Dust, about a Hasidic man who loses his wife, and he becomes so concerned about her neshama, as he always says, that he basically works with a science professor to figure out the decomposition of her body and what's happening, so we could really trace that science element of it. And it stars Geza Rohrig, who is an actor who was in the movie Son of Saul, which won an Oscar a few years ago. And he's someone who actually is very observant. And he said, this is a really interesting film, but don't try this at home. This is not, it's a movie that opens with him basically hearing that his wife has died and, saying Baruch Dayan Emet and trying to rip his shirt and failing. And so it's like a scene played for laughs. So why the specificity, especially if the rest of the content doesn't work after? I really don't know. Again, it's something that excites me, but I always feel it's 90% accurate, if that, and I'd love for it to really be 100% there.
I see that Ken has his hand raised. Can I ask a quick question before Ken? I have seen A Serious Man and have wondered why that receives so much praise. It's one of those films, obviously, that watching as a Jewish person, I found cringeworthy, and I'm still not clear on what the message was, why people were so fascinated by it.
That's fair. That was a film early on for me. I got to speak with the Coen brothers right before I saw that film, I wish I'd done it after I'd seen it because I couldn't ask any questions. They are people who I think would admit that they have a very complicated relationship with their Judaism, where they can't separate themselves from it. but it's such a part of them, but not something that they appreciate. And so I think that's another sort of striving for authenticity. I think that's one example where I think they're wearing tefillin during the bar mitzvah, which is probably on Shabbat, which I wasn't sure why they were doing that. But to me, it was a very compelling film, but not necessarily for reasons of Judaism. I do think that its connection to the book of Job and the idea of somebody who is just constantly suffering no matter what he does, I think that part is very compelling. I think starting with the story about the goy's teeth, I just don't know where they get this stuff from, but to me, it's interesting that filmmakers who are as prominent as that and who make a lot of films that don't have anything to Judaism, that they wanted to do something related to that, and that it's a Best Picture nominee from the Oscars. I think that's really interesting. I obviously had a more positive experience of the film than you did, but I do think it's, again, I think that's probably accurate too. The idea of somebody who's so bored during Hebrew school, he listens to a cassette player the whole time, and then has to meet with the senior rabbi who's going to take it away from him. And again, very, very interesting, but a strange relationship with Judaism.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ken, did you want to share?
Yeah, just in our limited time, just to be a mile wide and an inch deep, there was, I heard an obituary of two different topics to comment on. I heard an obituary of an Italian actor who played in one of these Star Wars TV spinoffs, a supply officer or something or other, as an Orthodox kippah, tzitzit wearing garb, because the director wanted somebody that was not an alien from the bar scene, but somebody that was accepted but not part of the community, and used an Orthodox guy in order to do it. There was nothing Jewish about it. You might have had 3 lines. Here's your, revolver and hat or whatever it was. And also, if I could take the opportunity just to ask about within the American Jewish experience, and we're coming up on Martin Luther King, and you spoke of suggestions in the months ahead. Are there any movies that Blacks and Jews are a shared experience, which some people think is there or not? Comment.
Interesting. Okay, so that's two very separate things. I think they're both very interesting. I always, whenever I think about Star Trek, not Star Wars, but I think about how deeply embedded Judaism is within that, the idea of Leonard Nimoy using something from the Kohen on Yom Kippur as, as the basis for everything, right? What you're doing, I think is so interesting. But I also always remember the idea of that being sort of not post-religion, but that Judaism, even though it's such a big part behind the scenes, was never reflected in science fiction in that way. And so I think that's a whole another conversation. But I do know that there's also a very unfortunate history, especially within Shakespeare, the Merchant of Venice and the Shylock character, the idea that someone who's recognizably and visibly Jewish or, observant in that way is never usually a good thing. And to that point, when you mentioned films that, the shared culture, that are, Black and Jewish, I think Selma is a really extraordinary film where there's a rabbi who's sort of in the front lines, but he's someone who is just, wearing a kippah. And he's not somebody who looks like Heschel, who is someone who was actually there, who had a, recognizable beard and was sort of, I think, recognizably Jewish in a way that's not so from looking. But I do think that there are a number of films that are interesting and do have a shared heritage. I'm not sure offhand that there's something that I can recommend that would be specifically, with both communities. But there is an extraordinary documentary coming out, I think in early January, called Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism in America, that talks about systemic racism and just the way that it's been, led to so much, and there's someone who used to work for the ACLU who is basically the main subject of this film. And there's a time where he goes to a Confederate monument and talks to someone there. And the guy basically says, slaves were happy, they were treated well. And this guy from the ACLU, who is Black, is engaging with him and talking to him and thanks him at the end for talking to him. And it's just such a powerful and interesting moment where someone is clearly willing to have a conversation, but obviously has a lot of problematic education that doesn't make any sense. So I think that was very interesting and is a very strong option.
Just very, very quick. I saw on IMDb there is a movie in post-production for release next year. It's a great title: Three Jews, Three Blacks, and a Jew in a bar. That
Okay. Yeah, no, that's definitely something to look. I haven't heard anything, but I'll do some research after this. And yes, and Liz commented about Driving Miss Daisy, which is definitely a good example, but also one that I think is a film that hasn't necessarily aged well in some ways. I think as we're having new conversations about things, but I do think that it's a good one. I know that we want to probably wrap up soon, but I wanted to ask before I just end with some recommendations if anyone else had anything else they wanted to share.
I think it's just fascinating that that we're talking about this like word of cringe. I think a lot of us, Jose, when you were talking about the movie Get, a lot of it is cringeworthy. And I'll be honest, the first time I saw it was actually in New York at a not in Israel, but rather in an American movie theater, and it was strange looking around the room and seeing people see this inside aspect of Judaism and knowing that this isn't always the best part, except there is this 10 minutes of this authentic Judaism for many of us. I don't think many of us outside of perhaps either Rabbi Wahlberg or I have been at many deliveries of gets. Something, a ritual that it's not publicly seen in the Jewish community. And so there are these also, it's interesting how film can bring us into different experiences that whether it's shtisel, being inside of the home that we might not have been invited to otherwise, or all these other things, Shiva baby, all these other crazy things. But I just think it's just funny to wrap up that there was this word of cringing that has come up multiple times tonight, and yet it also draws us all in to this conversation of we like seeing Jews on the screen, and also we're always a little bit skeptical.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Shiva Baby, which Rabbi Halder mentioned, is another example of a film that is so Jewish, but also so surface. Like it is, I'm fascinated by it, but I also, it doesn't really get to anything about Judaism in a way that I wished it had in some ways, but it's definitely worth seeing, though it might be an acquired taste. And so I'll just note a couple of recommendations for the next couple weeks based on your viewing habits, your comfort level of going into a theater, and your subscription to certain services. These films are not necessarily Jewish. One of them is a little bit, but they're just the kinds of things that I've been hearing a lot about during award season and I've enjoyed recently. In theaters, there is a film called Licorice Pizza, which is really quite interesting and sort of singular. That one has a lot to do with Judaism, which I found, you'll judge for yourself whether it's good or bad, but I thought that the film was quite interesting. A good family experience is Encanto, which is a new Disney film that's been out for a couple weeks. That's really wonderful and has a lot to do with Colombian heritage and community, which is really nice. It has the music of Lin-Manuel Miranda, which I think most people tend to enjoy. And for an altogether different experience, director Kenneth Branagh made a movie called Belfast, which is loosely based on his childhood growing up in Ireland, and it is remarkable. And if I had to guess right now, I think it would win the Oscar for Best Picture this coming March, but we'll see. On Netflix, two other likely Oscar contenders that are both very serious and worth seeing: The Power of the Dog from director Jane Campion. And that is a very new edition, I think, just recently, and Passing, which is set, I believe, in the 1920s from director Rebecca Hall. On Amazon Prime Video, I'm sure we have a lot of I Love Lucy fans in this crowd. And there is a movie called Being the Ricardos that is coming next week to Amazon. Nicole Kidman does not look like Lucille Ball, but I think she does do a fantastic job in the role. And another heartwarming family story, The Tender Bar, which is from director George Clooney. That's coming in early January. Two more on Hulu. Together is a really fun exploration of a surrogate relationship that has been out for quite a while. I played at the Sundance Film Festival last year, but something you may not have come across, with Ed Helms from The Office. And on Apple TV Plus, the film that out of the 260-something films that I've seen this year remains my favorite is CODA, which stands for Child of Deaf Adults. And it's a story about a teenager whose parents and brother are all deaf, and about her interest in being part of that community and being part of her community. And that's a really remarkable film that, again, is on Apple TV+. There are plenty of other films. As Robbie Hollander mentioned, I have my own sites, movieswithabe.com and tvwithabe.com, and I write for a number of other sites about awards contenders. And so always open to consider recommendations. It's nice to hear, especially from from Ken, about some films I haven't heard of yet that I want to explore. And so I'm appreciative to all of you, and especially to Rabbi Hollander and to Shira for inviting me to join you in this space tonight.
Abe, we want to thank you so much for a really fun hour. I know this is something that Rabbi Hollander and I speak about all the time, and I think Jewish movies and film are so impactful and such a great tool to both teach and learn from, and also just really fun. So I just want to thank you so much for taking the time. This was so enjoyable, and we really hope that we have the opportunity to have you back in the future. And thank you, of course, to all of you for coming out with us tonight.
Thank you so much.